All right, good afternoon, y'all. The Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Government Innovation will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Love those red glasses. Those are super cool. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time, and I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Good afternoon and welcome to this hearing of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Government Innovation. An important role of this subcommittee is ensuring federal information technology is well managed, as you all are well aware. The federal government depends on IT systems for everything from national defense to homeland security to the administration of benefits programs. In all, we spend upwards of $100 billion of tax dollars annually for federal IT. Notably, 75 to 80% of this spend currently goes to operate and maintain existing IT systems, and much of that infrastructure is aging and obsolete. It relies on a shrinking pool of workers versed in archaic programming languages like COBOL, which came into common use 60 years ago. I myself learned COBOL when I was starting my career in the late 90s. And even then, we knew that it was a legacy IT system. In fact, I was in the financial services sector working in COBOL. And if I see another line of COBOL code today, I might vomit, I might throw up. But at that time and now, computer coding provides a pathway for girls and women to advance into STEM fields, but gosh, I hope we can get beyond COBOL one day. But today's aspiring young coders, they're not learning COBOL. That's why the government, whose aging IT workforce includes many more individuals over 60 than under 30. It's actually 4 times-ish in terms of those that are looking at retirement in the next few years versus those that are coming in that are younger and more adept with computer engineering and programming. A few years ago, GAO compiled a list of the 10 federal IT systems most in need of overhaul due to their criticality and their obsolescence. One is a COBOL-based system used to process about 20 million federal student financial aid applications annually. The system is older than the Department of Education, which opened its doors in 1980. That's kind of scary, if you ask us. Another COBOL-based system on GAO's list is an IRS system containing taxpayer data that went online in 1968. Long before I was born, more than a half century ago. The IRS continues to keep taxpayer data on this system and other hugely outdated systems, despite pouring billions of dollars over the years into failed modernization efforts. And I would be remiss if I didn't add on, with the advent of AI and archaic legacy systems, archaic coding, consumer data, personal data, government data is all at a much higher risk today than it ever has been. And the way in which AI can be utilized to get after authentication, for example, it puts us in our data, government and the private sector at those risks at an all-time high. The Biden administration is now set to hire 20,000 new auditors over 2 years as part of a massive $80 billion hike in IRS spending, but what the IRS needs most are modern computers and call centers that answer the phone. What scares me is that federal legacy computer systems are highly vulnerable to cyber attacks from malicious actors, including enemy nation states. And the danger is going to get a lot worse and fast. The rise of AI, oh, look at my notes, they already have AI, and I already skipped ahead, will soon lead to increasingly sophisticated cyber assaults. That's why it's more important than ever that data of millions of students and taxpayers don't live on half-century-old IT systems that are easily exploited by our enemies. So we need to take and make progress on IT modernization by whatever means necessary and at our disposal. A new funding vehicle, the Technology Modernization Fund, was created in 2017. It provided another tool for replacing legacy IT. But it's become clear that it's a tool that needs sharpening. So I intend to introduce legislation soon that will do just that. I expect this hearing to help inform that bill. Congress must act to ensure taxpayer personally identifiable information and other sensitive data are not wide open for thieves or foreign actors to plunder. The U.S. Chamber issued a statement. We have this beautiful letter today that we will enter into the record for today's hearing. It says, at a time when America is confronting inflation and budgetary stresses, Congress must look to find new and creative ways to solve fiscal challenges and improve services through government IT modernization. And I could not agree more. This subcommittee will continue to focus its oversight and legislative efforts on innovative solutions that actually move the needle on the old problem of IT modernization. And that's what this legislation will do. That's what this hearing will do today. And it's my hope that if we do nothing else in this Congress, because I doubt that we will, that we can find some nonpartisan, I'm not kidding, that we can find a way, both sides, to work on this issue. This is not a partisan issue. And I hope that you'll work with us and our committee in finding ways that we can sharpen the tools that we have going forward. So with that, I will yield to the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for having this hearing and your commitment to this critical set of issues that challenge all of us. To best accomplish their public service missions, federal agencies need information technology systems that are efficient, effective, and secure. From facilitating veterans' online access to health and pension benefits to processing millions of taxpayers' vital IRS refunds, IT keeps our country running 24 hours, 7 days a week. But as we know, not all IT systems are created equal, as you just pointed out, Madam Chair. In fact, the Government Accountability Office found that of the $100 billion or so dedicated to IT and cyber-related investments, as much as 80% of those dollars are spent on operation and maintenance expenses, including legacy systems. While age itself is not inherently an indication of poor performance, those that are written in outdated languages, as you just indicated, like COBOL, or are operating on unsupported hardware and software, leave our government vulnerable to security threats. It's vital, therefore, that we work together to identify and update the legacy systems that need to be replaced. During my tenure as chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, I focused the gavel on IT modernization. Over the course of 8 hearings in the 117th Congress alone, we established that achieving quality IT demands 3 components: cost effectiveness, prioritize customer experience, and robust cyber infrastructure. While each of these factors may seem independently important, they are related and create the foundation for agency success. That's why I'm immensely proud to have worked with my former Republican colleagues on this subcommittee to establish the Technology Modernization Fund. We engineered the TMF to reimagine and transform the way federal agencies invest in modern, nimble technology and to deliver services to families, businesses, and communities. We wrote the TMF with the clear intent to provide a flexible funding stream outside of the traditional appropriation process. We sought to enable multi-year investments that catalyze sweeping, complex, and transformative IT projects. TMF-funded IT modernization projects lower agency operating costs over time and fortify cybersecurity. Last year, the White House announced it would designate $100 million of the revolutionary $1 billion infusion in the TMF to improve federal agency customer experience. The investments, if made wisely, could reduce wait times for vital services, eliminate duplicative, time-consuming paperwork, and remove bureaucratic barriers that waste taxpayers' time and federal agency resources. These efforts will rebuild public trust between themselves and our public institutions. I'm proud to note that of the 39 projects that secured TMF investments across 24 agencies, GAO estimates that 25 have aspects of cybersecurity, with 11 projects primarily focused on security issues. By upgrading vulnerable systems, our federal government can better protect itself and the people it serves from data breaches, critical infrastructure hacks, and the leakage of national security information. I hope to continue the subcommittee's bipartisan tradition and work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to reauthorize this program. I also remain committed to using the FITARA scorecard as a tool to modernize legacy IT. Over its past 15 iterations, this oversight effort has resulted in more than $6.6 billion in cost savings and avoidance from 2012 to 2021 alone. The lion's share of the success comes from the closure of unnecessary data centers and agencies' migration to the cloud. The scorecard works hand in glove with the goals of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, including pushing for the elimination of legacy IT systems. As a result, our subcommittee recently updated the new cybersecurity metric on the FITARA scorecard to include zero trust as a component of the score. This evolution incentivizes agencies to modernize and stay in front of emerging cyber threats. In addition, the scorecard has improved agencies' IT investment and development strategies by addressing cost overruns, schedule slippages, and poor project management. We must improve how we track IT modernization planning and implementation. We know what happens when an agency doesn't have a plan, doesn't have timelines for project completion, and is not delivering on its modernization goals. In a recent GAO study that I requested, GAO found that IT challenges at the IRS, for example, are substantial due to planning and implementation deficiencies. Legacy IT costs are still unknown. Modernization plans lack timelines for the disposition of legacy systems. Nearly a quarter of the agency's software inventory is legacy software. And the effort to replace the 60-year-old individual master file is on hold with no end in sight. Lastly, the scorecard emphasizes the need for agency IT working capital funds, separate appropriations accounts within an agency designated specifically for modernization and other essential IT investments that can be used outside of the rigid and sometimes unpredictable annual appropriation process. Embracing modern and secure IT solutions is crucial for federal agencies to streamline operations, enhance cybersecurity, and fulfill their missions. I know that everyone on this dais is interested in and committed to ensuring that we have 21st century federal government for our constituents. I intend to continue our committee's dogged oversight of federal agencies' IT modernization effort to ensure that we live up to that commitment. Again, I want to welcome our panelists. I've worked with all three. I think they're great choices today, Madam Chairwoman, and I look forward to hearing from their testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Our first witness is Mr. Kevin Walsh, Director of Information and Technology at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO. Our second witness is Ms. Suzette Kent, a Global Business Transformation Executive who's previously served as the Federal Chief Information Officer for the United States. And our third witness is Mr. David Pauner, Director for Strategic Engagement and Partnerships with the MITRE Corporation. We welcome everyone, and we're pleased to have you here this afternoon. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. We appreciate all of you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we've read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statements to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button in the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members up here can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow, and when the red light comes on, your 5 minutes has expired, and we would just ask that you please wrap up your comments. I would like to recognize Mr. Walsh to please begin your opening statement.
Chairwoman Mace, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting GAO to testify on this important issue. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that the government has a legacy IT problem. However, it's hard to know the true scope of the issue. According to the MGT Act, a legacy IT system is outdated or obsolete. To build on that, our federal CIO has noted that not all old systems are legacy, and old doesn't necessarily mean bad, antiquated, risky, or in need of retirement. I agree. Replacing all of the old IT in the government would be a monstrous task and probably a waste of funds. The federal CIO is most concerned with a legacy that is out of support, can't be patched, has availability issues, or can't meet user needs or policy goals. Systems whose security cannot keep pace with adversaries. Again, I agree. Those worrisome situations will become more prevalent if we ignore our aging technology. As our systems get older, they cost more to secure, more to maintain, don't always meet mission needs, and, in some cases, the only people who can update them are retired. Some of these systems may persist because agencies are not required to identify and evaluate what should be kept. OMB drafted guidance in 2016 that would have required agencies to do exactly that. Regrettably, that guidance remains in draft form. To OMB's credit, their subsequent 2018 guidance on high-value assets could cover the most important legacy systems. However, the government cannot afford to ignore the rest of its IT. In addition, the recently released National Cyber Strategy calls for federal efforts to eliminate legacy systems that are costly to maintain and difficult to defend against sophisticated cyber threats. However, it will be hard for the government to eliminate legacy systems if we don't know what we have. To do so, agencies would need an inventory of their IT systems, as called for in OMB's draft guidance. After that, agencies should identify their legacy systems, prioritize them to determine what we should keep, or modernize, replace, or retire. These decisions could be based on factors including how risky it will be, including risks to security and privacy, the criticality of the system, cost to modernize or maintain the current system, as well as any potential cost savings, whether mission needs are being met, and if additional functionality or benefits could be gained. To be clear, there will be instances where modernization may not make sense at this time. That's a good thing. We want agencies to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. Having the newest toys and gadgets, like Batman, doesn't necessarily mean good governance or even good IT. There will also be modernizations that cost more money than they save. However, in those instances, there should be other benefits that can be gained, such as increased cybersecurity, better functionality, or better performance. These reviews of agencies' IT portfolios to identify legacy IT should also not be a one-time exercise. They should be part of a core part of our portfolio management in the government. Finally, as we modernize or replace our systems, we should make sure that the old systems get turned off. This concludes my comments, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. And I now would like to recognize Ms. Kent for your 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Mace, Ranking Member Conley, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you regarding federal information technology. This committee has been unwavering in demonstrating bipartisan commitment to improving the mission outcomes of government through better uses of technology. Reminders of the dangers of archaic IT infrastructure are evident every day in both public and private sector. Data stolen, travel disrupted, power grids compromised, people and businesses deprived of services, lives threatened, and our homeland security impugned. And these dangers are like ticking time bombs, becoming more severe as the use of AI and the attacks on encrypted data become more sophisticated. And despite congressional and executive branch directives, despite creation of new funding vehicles, and the ever-present pressure of mission needs, some agencies have still struggled to make significant progress tackling that technical debt. My comments today are going to draw from personal experiences of over 30 years in global technology and having served as the federal CIO and working closely with IT teams to address these issues. But let's reflect very quickly on the current situation. The strategic plan and annual budget process should be the primary lever, but it's not timely and budgets have been flat for the last decade. The Technology Modernization Fund, it was created as a source for urgent needs and to provide a multi-year vehicle focusing on legacy IT transition, cybersecurity, and emerging technology, but it could use sharpening. Working capital funds. This vehicle gives agencies flexibility, but not all agencies have chosen to establish a working capital fund. And we do have public-private partnerships and grants that are effective to explore new technology, but these are not scale options. Although these tools have all yielded positive results, it's not at the pace of technology change or at a scale that overcomes technical debt. So some areas for exploration for this committee could be reestablishing priority, making legacy transition an agency priority, and updating how those outcomes are measured. Give agencies a specific directive and update one of the various scoring mechanisms, ROI, FITARA, IT dashboard, or potentially new measures to bring laser focus to agency progress, eliminating outdated technology. As you heard from Mr. Walsh, there's long been ambiguity about defining legacy, but focus on cyber vulnerabilities in areas that hinder the mission goals, and consider using the GAO reports of legacy systems with the most significant risk to aim these directives. Enhance the planning processes by mandating comprehensive transformation plans with financial estimates and timelines. Congress, if directing agencies to produce a plan for migration for the most egregious applications, Congress could then validate those plans are incorporated into agency strategic plans, support the funding based on those plans, and hold agencies accountable. In this way, Congress supports the actions from end to end. And this is very important because it is likely these efforts span multiple administrations, so bipartisan support is critical. Modernizing the process for defining project value, expanding business case metrics to include things beyond cost savings like risk reduction, value to mission, or improved resource availability, and very important, modernizing workforce. Accelerate the Office of Personnel Management's commitment to expanding skills-based hiring for technology roles. Current technology use requires current skills, regardless if people lack traditional post-secondary academic degrees. Skills-based hiring should not be looked at as an exception, but as a real pathway forward to rejuvenate the federal workforce. Technology capabilities are available to do this, and they're proven. Congress can accelerate overhaul of legacy systems by making it a clear priority, shining a light on what's wrong with the processes, focusing measurement, funding on the problem, and using expanded pathways to bring in talent that can deliver this transition. These are the areas that I would submit where Congress can be an accelerator for modernizing the technology that runs our government and serves the people of our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kent. And now, Mr. Pauner, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairwoman Mace, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on federal IT. I work for MITRE, a nonprofit corporation that operates in the public interest. Currently, I lead its Center for Data-Driven Policy, where we draw on our expertise on topics like acquisition and cybersecurity to bring objective, nonpartisan insights to policymakers. Prior to joining MITRE, I was at GAO, where I worked closely with this committee, crafting FTARA, helping with the creation of the scorecard, and assisting in its bipartisan IT oversight. This included oversight of legacy systems. Memorably, I testified at a 2016 hearing on legacy systems when then Chairman Chaffetz opened the hearing by waving an 8-inch floppy disk that was used on a backup nuclear command and control system. We all understand what's at stake here. Critical federal systems are operating with known security vulnerabilities and unsupported hardware and software. These legacy systems support important missions like wartime readiness and operation of critical infrastructure. Before I get into the main points of my testimony, I first want to commend this committee for its consistent and bipartisan oversight of cyber and IT issues over the past 10 years. This committee's leadership has resulted in more secure and efficient federal operations and considerable cost savings. I have two overarching points to make this afternoon. First, despite recent calls for action on our nation's critical legacy systems, the federal government's plans, budgets, and actions are not where they need to be. Second, I think it's essential that Congress steps forward and takes the lead by putting in place legislation that requires prioritized inventories, related modernization plans, and actions to ensure progress against those plans. I'd like to expand on each of these. In late 2001, we published a paper that made several recommendations to Congress to update the 2014 Federal Information Security Modernization Act, known as FISMA, to meet the advanced threats posed by China, Russia, and nation states. One recommendation was to modernize legacy IT systems to reduce costs and vulnerability. Last year, I testified at the FTARA 13 scorecard hearing and helped to author a paper published by the American Council for Technology Industry Advisory Council, known as ACT-IACT, on evolving the FTARA scorecard. Both my testimony and that report recommended an IT modernization category be added to the scorecard. Last year, Senators Maggie Hassan and John Cornyn introduced the Legacy IT Reduction Act of 2022 that required agencies to develop an inventory of legacy IT systems and a plan to modernize those systems. And the current administration has also highlighted the need to address legacy IT systems. Most recently, the White House in its National Cybersecurity Strategy called for OMB to develop a plan to accelerate IT modernization and specifically to eliminate legacy systems. Despite the many calls to action, agency modernization plans and efforts to replace these systems have failed to keep pace. There are several reasons for this, including the complexity of upgrading older versions of software, a reluctance to accept the risks of transferring mission-critical processing off of mainframes to cloud solutions, a short-term focus driven by annual budgets, and the lack of executive branch policies and legislation calling for multi-year budgets to support modernization. Congress has an opportunity to catalyze this needed modernization effort. My written statement contains 10 recommendations for OMB, Congress, agencies, and industry. The 2 recommendations for Congress are this. 1, enact legislation similar to the Legacy IT Reduction Act of 2022, introduced last session in the Senate, and implement the FTAR scorecard recommendation, which includes adding a legacy modernization category to it. The other recommendations call for OMB to apply more urgency to their directives and for agencies to apply AI and machine learning to extract information from legacy IT platforms. In summary, the U.S. has long been a global leader in technology. We have the tools and the expertise required to modernize and improve our outdated government IT systems. What's needed now is leadership and action. We look forward to working with you, Chairwoman Mason, Ranking Member Connolly. This concludes my statement. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank you all for the testimony you submitted today, the feedback, your ideas, legislative and otherwise, and explaining, why we are where we are today. One of the interesting things, Mr. Walsh, about your testimony today was acknowledging that the federal government doesn't know, I guess, what all systems that we have, which is deeply concerning to me. I would think we've got contracts, we have receipts for the contracts we have, that we would have some way to track this. And I guess we don't have a system that tracks what software different agencies has right now.
So in some cases, yes, we aren't accurately tracking. In other cases, it's the right hand not knowing what the left is doing. And in a third case, I would add, identifying something as legacy requires being familiar with what it's doing and not doing well. In a lot of cases, we are not doing a good enough job evaluating our own systems and figuring out what's working and what's not.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then compared to the private sector, Mr. Walsh, the federal government spends a greater proportion of its IT budget operating and maintaining legacy systems rather than investing in new ones. And you have sort of a different perspective on this too. But do you believe it tends to make the federal data that we have more vulnerable to cyber attacks because of that? What are your thoughts on that?
So in part, yes. As our systems get older, they get more vulnerable, easier to hack, and certainly less secure, harder to maintain. The private sector spends less, has better technology, but they face different threats, right? In terms of cybersecurity, nation-state actors are much more focused on us. They are still going after the private sector, especially, China, Iran, certain other bad actors like Russia as well.
Yeah.
But our legacy IT can afford to get older because we're trying to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. I think, as I said, having all the newest and the best tools works for private industry, the big companies, Google, Microsoft, and the like. But I personally would not want all the newest tools to be at USDA. I want the tools that are right, that are doing their job well, and I want USDA to periodically look at them and make that evaluation. But having the newest flashbang, computers should not be something that the government entertains.
Thank you. And then, as I mentioned earlier in my opening statement, the federal government employs about 4 times as many IT professionals over the age of 60 versus under the age of 30. And we seem to be doubling down on outdated technology and older hires. We actually had the director of OPM here, and this is not your fault, but it was the worst witness we've ever had. I mean, ever. I mean, it was just terrible. And I was just shocked that she was able to even hold that position. But when we look at that issue of hiring employees, we recently saw a report that GAO reported the Social Security Administration recently had to hire tech folks out of retirement to maintain its COBOL system. So how can we as a government that is so slow, that is so bureaucratic, and is so old, not literally, but literally and figuratively in the IT systems that we have, how can we assemble a younger, more tech-savvy workforce when, in its most pressing need for experts that have obsolete software needs, right? And so without such a workforce, how can we move forward? We have all these people retiring soon the next couple of years and not hiring enough young. So what are some of your thoughts on how we address that challenge?
So in some cases, we have already done, and your committee has been a large part of this, given the flexibility to agencies to try and find new ways to put money into IT and also try to find new ways to get more IT talent into the government. Because you're absolutely right, we're facing a pending wave of federal employees who are going to retire and take a lot of knowledge and expertise with them. If we're going to avoid paying a premium to bring them back from the golf courses, then we need to make sure that we have that next cadre of IT professionals coming.
And they don't need a college degree to do it either, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I have a member of my family never went to college, makes more money than I do, he's 21 and owns his own home. I'm like, I did this wrong. When I got out of school programming, we were making $35,000 a year in the late 90s, so much different perspective. I got one last question I did want to ask. FAA, issues with legacy systems, and the FAA, legacy system failures, critical agency functions were on full display earlier this year when the FAA in January had to suspend flights because of a breakdown of a key computer system in my district at Hilton Head Island Airport. Outdated technology forces air traffic controllers to use binoculars. 1800s level technology to coordinate plane landings. How many such critical federal operations are running on outdated technologies like this anywhere? It's
Uncountable.
bad.
Uncountable. Disappointingly.
Yeah.
Enormous.
Yeah, thank you. I would now like to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Ms. Kent, we talked about bipartisanship. You worked in what administration as CIO?
I was appointed during the Trump administration.
And did you find us cooperative in your endeavors?
I found this committee to be engaging and cooperative as we sought ways, much like these challenges, to move forward.
Right. I don't want to ruin your reputation in certain quarters, but I thought it was a very productive relationship, and I'm so glad to see you again. And thank you for your efforts to try to promote positive change within the federal government. Why, in your experience as CIO, why don't we just retire legacy systems? I mean, my refrigerator is old, I replace it. After 20 years, certainly after 60. So why don't, you were CIO, what's your experience in terms of why federal agencies don't do it?
Risk, cost, and resources. And I want to use a specific example that kind of harkens back to the last question. One of the TMF projects that we did was a project for HUD. And what they looked at was the fact that they had 7 legacy systems. We started with 3 that had 7 million lines of COBOL code. And that was written by a small group of individuals that were no longer able to help with any modernization efforts.
They weren't even on the golf course.
They weren't even on the golf course. They weren't even available to show up at work. And what we did was actually bring in technology to convert that 7 million lines of code to 1.2 million lines of Java, so that we could actually, we used a tool, we tested the tool, the agency moved the capabilities, they managed the risk during that effort, and now we could hire new college grads because they were competent in Java. And so that's a great example of an agency stepping forward. They accepted the risk, they made the technology investment, and then they hired the people to sustain the path going forward. But not every agency chooses to be that bold.
I think you put it well, risk and cost particularly. Mr. Powner, from your days at GAO, it's a big deal to replace your legacy systems and maybe upgrade your IT while you're at it. I mean, we're talking multi-billion-dollar, multi-year kind of thing. For a manager to invest political capital in that endeavor is a big deal, and he or she may not be around to even see the fruits of that endeavor. And then, even though we spend $100 billion a year, 80% of it's spoken for, and so I do need working capital, don't I, to try to decide to make this big decision.
Yeah, I think the key here is you need a long-term, multi-year focus to tackle these problems. The annual budget cycle does not help with that. And that's where I think legislation, if you could get focused on the right set of systems that we really need to tackle. I agree with Mr. Walsh that there's a lot of these systems out there.
But let me interrupt you if I may, because I'm going to run out of time. But isn't that why Congress, led by my former Republican colleague Will Hurd on this subcommittee, created TMF? To have working capital to try to incentivize people to go beyond the year-to-year.
Yeah, but both TMF and the working capital funds in the MGT Act were both two tools that you really want to use, as Ms. Kent mentioned, moving forward. But I do think you need a prioritized inventory because we have so many of these things, and that's where I think the focus from Congress requiring that prioritized inventory that could be tracked not only by the Congress, but tracked by the federal CIO, and also you could use the IT dashboard for transparency. We need the better light and focus on these things so that we can make progress on not only putting good plans in place, but eventually putting new systems in place.
Real quickly, Mr. Walsh, has this FITARA scorecard and 17 oversight hearings with respect to it, do you think made a material difference in incentivizing federal agencies to upgrade their IT?
Yes.
Save money?
Yes.
Ms. Kent, same question.
It definitely placed focused and saved money. And as we have had many conversations in the past, it's like the IT question that we're talking about is we need to continue to advance what we measure and be very focused on the next
Absolutely.
challenge.
Mr. Powner, same
Yeah,
question.
yes, it has, and I think it's important to evolve it to things like our workforce, like better metrics in the cybersecurity area, and legacy modernization.
Yeah, and just let me end, Madam Chairwoman, I'd be delighted to work with you in adding this legacy modernization category to the scorecard because I think we've got to have plans in place to finally retire legacy systems and a timeline and a budget for how we do that. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you again to our panel.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I would now like to recognize Congressman Timmons from the great state of South Carolina for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have served as a prosecutor in a local district attorney's office. I have been in the state Senate, and I've been in Congress for a number of years. And this has been an ongoing question. How do we effectively modernize our IT to make sure that we are good stewards of the data that we have? And I think the bigger challenge is the government doesn't really have traditional accountability. Private businesses are fined or settle court cases for over $1 billion, hundreds of millions of dollars. So there is a free market incentive for what motivates them to protect their data. We recently had the DC Health Exchange in. They're a hybrid. They're pseudo quasi-government. So it's interesting to see how that plays out. The CFPB recently had a breach, and that was more user error, but that resulted in 250,000 individuals' personally identifiable information to be leaked, which resulted in a lot of fraudulent unemployment claims, which, it's very interesting what people do with data. But again, this is just a major problem, and I want to talk about damages. What happens to the CFPB? What is the recourse for the individuals that have been aggrieved based off of a government breach, based off of a government failure to protect data from individuals, in many cases, that they force to interact with? Mr. Walsh, what is the recourse?
You would hope that it would be like the private sector, as we've all received, I'm sure, numerous notices that our data has been breached, that they would provide some assistance, but I am not familiar with what would happen if the CFPB were hacked.
Well, we've had a lot of government data breaches. I mean, I don't see huge $100 million settlements from the government. We have sovereign immunity. You're not allowed to sue the federal government. You're not allowed to sue the state or local government. So, I mean, really, the recourse is likely people get fired. I mean, is that kind of the recourse?
So people could be fired. One would hope that people would be held accountable through hearings such as this today, but I would not want to speculate.
Well, let's get to the root of the problem. I mean, we have servers all over the country that are extremely expensive to update. The training necessary to implement best practices as it relates to employees accessing data is not cheap. I'm in the Air Force, and we do these ridiculous trainings online that is just really the bane of my existence when I go to drill. But, I mean, the answer is eventually going to be cloud migration, and that should save money long term once we are no longer spending money on maintenance. I see, Mr. Pono, you're nodding your head. Is that fair?
Yeah, clearly there could be long-term savings going to the cloud, but the thing with these legacy applications is during the transition, you're running dual operations typically, so there's always an investment initially with long-term with savings down the road. We talked about the IRS system. I mean, if we looking at the individual master file, you're going to have to run dual operations there for a while, and it's going to result in an investment. Now, long term, are you going to save on maintenance costs and those type of things? Yes. And are you going to have better security? Yes. But there is going to be some investment during that transition that you're going to have to bite the bullet.
Well, I just tried to pay my federal taxes, and it's extremely complicated, the dual-factor authentication. It's effective. It just requires me to look back at historical taxes. If we had something like that during the pandemic for either PPP loans or for EIDL loans, we would have, or for unemployment claims, we would have saved, I don't know, $500 billion. So, I mean, we're already seeing the costs of not having, I wouldn't even call that, best practice. That's just basic. Dual-factor authentication to confirm the user's identity that is accessing a government system is so basic that it's shocking that we don't have it. And because we didn't have it at SBA, it cost $500 billion. I mean, any guess what it would have cost 2 years ago, or let's just say before the pandemic, 3 or 4 years ago, to make sure that SBA had used dual-factor authentication? Probably less than $1 billion, maybe a couple $100 million. What do you think, Mr. Walsh?
That certainly seems reasonable for a couple $100 million.
So we could have spent a couple $100 million to save $500 billion. And I think that we're just seeing the beginning of this. We're going to continue to have increasing frequency and degree of breaches or of uses where it would have benefited greatly. So I appreciate that y'all are here testifying before us. This is very important, and we need to keep working on it. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would now recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you, Ann, the ranking member. And thank you to our witnesses for your willingness to help the committee with its work. So as the ranking member pointed out earlier, we're spending about $100 billion a year on cyber systems, although 80% of that, $80 billion is actually going to maintain legacy systems that we're supposed to be converting. What is there a system in place where we automatically say, okay, this system has been in place since 1973 and we're getting rid of it? Or is it left up to the individual agency to adopt a program of modernization and going to a more robust system?
So there is no such system that says just because it's old, we need to retire it. In fact, just because it's old, I think we should do an evaluation, but there may be good cases where it doesn't make sense from a benefit perspective or even a cost perspective to retire something just because of age.
Yeah, I know I read a report by, I think it was the FBI, that said that right now we're outnumbered like 50 to 1 in terms of, even if we put everybody on cybersecurity in the U.S. government, just on China, they would still, the number of hackers would outnumber us like 50 to 1. That's if, just with China. And I'm concerned that if we don't change up the way we're doing things here, even the most, I guess, ordinary systems are now targets of Chinese hackers, right? They said that they actually hacked the Merit Systems Board as well, which basically just handles federal employee complaints and you know, fairly mundane issues. But there's so much hacking going on, even those more mundane and systems that we wouldn't consider as threatened or as important as others, they're actually targets. So I don't know if we can afford to leave any legacy system that is porous in place. And I think it's a, you know, it's a sign of inattention or lack of priorities that I've been coming to these meetings for these hearings for about 20 years, and yet we seem to be going over the same ground again and again, and there's no robust system for changing this out. And I'm searching for a way to make that happen. I know it'll be painful for some of these agencies. I know that in many cases, employees might be comfortable with a legacy system. They know how that operates. It would require them to you know, train themselves on a new system, but I think it's necessary for the national security of this nation. And I'm just wondering if you have any, I mean, you've been dealing with this up front every single day for a long, long time. What are your recommendations that we might, you know, light a fire under some of these people to make them, you know, adopt the modernizations that are necessary?
Well, I clearly think there needs to be more consistency agency to agency on how we tackle legacy issues. And you mentioned these major security vulnerabilities, and I think Representative Timmons brought up, you know, not being able to use multi-factor authentication. Well, many of these legacy systems make it difficult to use multi-factor authentication. That's a tenet of what we're trying to go towards with zero trust, with cybersecurity. So I would start with the legacy systems, and we could talk about unmet mission needs. We can talk about high maintenance costs. But if you have a security vulnerability, that needs to be right at the top of the list. And I think a prioritization criteria should come from OMB. I'm not saying Congress needs to come up with the criteria, but I think Congress and legislation should direct OMB to have prioritization criteria so that we have more consistency, Representative Lynch, and would better address the key points that you're making.
Is there do we have the ability to say, okay, a system under, that's being used by a certain department is not capable of delivering zero trust compliance under the President's initiative? Is there an ability to rule some of these systems out that are not capable of compliance and get rid of those?
You would have to go to probably each individual agency and have that discussion with their CIOs and CISOs, but the answer is you could do that, yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you for your courtesy, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Of course, I would now like to recognize Congressman Burleson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I'm going to try to rapid fire some questions here, but I've been here 4 months, so I'm just trying to get my head wrapped around how we do IT and the federal level. So can you give me an idea, do different agencies, do they have full control? Do they have stand up their own IT departments and have their own funding? Do they make decisions unilaterally without context?
So each agency, yes, in the majority of cases has its own IT department, and in addition, agencies that have components or bureaus may also have their own bureaus or departments.
And within those, do you have programming teams?
You have programming teams, you have contractors, you have CISOs, the whole gamut.
How many how many different of the products that we manage or that within the federal government, given a particular agency, and you might, this is again maybe hard to answer, but how much of it is in-house programmed versus vendor purchase?
So I know that we would be heavily in favor of the government using COTS, commercially off-the-shelf software, or GOTS, government off-the-shelf software. But I don't know of any specific study that has identified government-wide what the mix of contractor built versus government built is.
And Kevin, if I might add, sir, to your question, it varies agency to agency. Some agencies they significantly have a staff that looks over their set of technology products. Others do leverage outside sources more significantly. And to your first question, each agency is actually charged with managing their own technology environment. And those are responsibilities that are tasked on the CIO. But the priority discussion that we've been having is the head of agency. And when it comes to how they operate, that is the responsibility of the CIO, but the funding priority and the initiatives, because many of these technology implementations impact operations and they impact mission, are an all-of-agency decision. So those things impact the pace of how the various agencies move forward.
Do any of the agencies decide to outsource the entire departments or the sections of IT?
Agencies use services provided as a service, but for various different things. We've had cloud discussions, multiple times. So that may be an example, but that does not absolve them of any of the responsibility for managing that technology or managing the risk. That is completely the responsibility of the agency, and that's why the choice in their partners is so important.
When it comes to, do you find, or is there any opportunities for, cost savings or any economies of scale where different agencies can leverage the same software?
So the government does some
No.
of that with its shared services initiative, where they try to bundle, multiple different agencies together.
I'm only smiling because one of the shared services initiatives was during the time that I served, and we were extremely focused on it. It's a perfect example of some of this legacy discussion. The mission support services, things like payroll and grants management, things that are done, some of our financial capabilities, they're done commonly across the entire federal government and governed by the same law. Yet we have 124 time and attendance entry systems across the government.
Yeah, ridiculous.
So we do have opportunity, but migrating is expensive and risky. And so that's why, we have seen slowness in moving to some of those centralized capabilities and further
And I imagine
consolidation.
these agencies, they don't want to give up the power that they have over this particular software. That's what I've seen in large-scale companies. You've
Yes,
got
sir.
different silos that they just want to control that silo. But my question to you is, since we're in the positions that we have, can we implement policy that forces that integration and that economy of scale?
I think there are certainly opportunities for that. And you looked at shared services, as one, and we have a list
And then
of
before
legacy
my
systems.
time is up, I wanted to ask, the industry, I remember studying the chaos report from the 90s, project management. Most IT projects are nothing like construction projects, and that within IT, there's a significant failure rate, cost overruns, overtime, over budget, around 45%, right? Our projects are successful. What is the success rate within the federal government across the board?
So I can't give you an exact number on what that is right now. We have not done that work. But I do think that the advent of modern techniques to do software development has helped lower that number. Things like agile software development, where you can hopefully, if you're going to fail sooner without wasting, billions of dollars.
Sir, I would add that the projects that are under the Technology Modernization Fund, there have only been 2 that have not hit their timeline, and there have been 0 that had cost overruns, because those are being managed using a more comprehensive and modern project process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I will now recognize Mr. Langworthy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Mace. Legacy IT systems continue to plague both our state and our federal governments, and this was made very evident by the challenges that my home state of New York faced with the Department of Labor during the COVID pandemic. The department struggled to issue payments in a timely and efficient manner due to its reliance on an outdated technology. And even more so, it issued an estimated $11 billion in either improper payments or fraudulent payments. Despite ongoing efforts to modernize, that department still faces significant hurdles due to legacy complications. Ms. Kent and Mr. Walsh, the cybersecurity strategy paints a pretty dire picture when it comes to the elevated cyber risk we have in the federal government due to all of the legacy IT systems at our agency levels. Now, specifically, what do agencies need to do to address the legacy IT problem, and how can we as a government accelerate the migration to cloud-based services?
So to address the legacy IT problem, I think first we need to figure out where it is. Every agency needs to have a good understanding of what their systems should be doing, evaluate them, see if they meet the mark, and if they don't, maybe it's time to think about that retirement or replacement. To the example you referenced where the State Department of Labor had troubles issuing payments for its unemployment insurance, I think that was a case of unanticipated capacity, right? During COVID, they had to suddenly ramp up, which, as you pointed out, cloud computing, where you can buy capacity on demand, is a lot easier to absorb that massive influx of capacity that may be unplanned for. So I think migrating to more modern data platforms would be another step that you could take to address that.
I would only add to that, sir, making it a priority. And you heard the example of unanticipated capacity needs, but moving into that environment was also not funded and had not been funded because there wasn't a view that that capacity was going to be needed, and New York was not alone with other states who kind of had that same approach. So a plan that continues to look forward and take advantage of modern technology capabilities that gives you scale and resilience should be a path that not only we on the federal agencies, but our state and local government, partners that deliver those services.
Mr. Walsh, in the past few years, GAO has written numerous reports regarding shared services, including the significant government cost savings of consolidating HR, payroll, financial services across the federal government, many of which rely on legacy and outdated technology systems. Can you provide a brief update on how agencies are doing in terms of modernization and consolidation with respect to implementation goals and milestones for agencies to transition from one provider to another?
So I do not have that information with me today, sir. I can take that question for the record, though.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Ms. Kent and Mr. Walsh, what should Congress be doing to address the challenge of IT modernization besides holding hearings like this? Are there specific legislative proposals that we should be thinking about, such as requiring agencies to inventory legacy IT or submit modernization plans?
Absolutely, and I think a good starting point would be OMB's 2016 draft guidance that was never finalized. If that were finalized, I think that would be a great starting point. In our 2018-2019 report, we also flagged some of the most important legacy systems in need of modernization. I think those would be a great starting point, although I would hope the agencies have been tracking and updating that list since then.
And sir, as I referenced in the opening statement, some agencies do have plans for modernization. And at times they have been submitted, and what goes into, there's not a realism about the budget, because in many cases, while you are supporting a legacy system and building a modern system, you are duplicating your costs. So being realistic about that process, other agencies have not even built a plan, a realistic plan that has cost estimates and an anticipated timeline. So that is an opportunity for Congress to push harder.
And just in my last remaining time here, are there regulatory or policy hurdles that make a transition to a cloud-based service challenging for the government?
There are, Yes and no. All agency CIOs are accountable for the risk and the performance for their particular agency. So as another member asked a question, you cannot outsource your risk. So in making those choices, there are services available. It is still incumbent upon that particular agency to do work to ensure that that is not a risky environment. Are the services available, and are they available commercially? In most cases, yes.
Just to add, in addition to the risk as you're making the go, no-go decision on the modernization, making sure that you're comfortable with the risks that the contractor or cloud service provider is taking to protect the government's data is something else that we need to keep focused on. Making sure that whether that's citizens, taxpayer data, whether that's data from the Department of Education on federal student loans or IRS, we need to make sure that those data are adequately protected.
Thank you for your time and your testimony. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I would now like to recognize Mr. Edwards from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To our witnesses, thank you for your time this afternoon and for your service to help out our great country. Ms. Kent, one of the things that you mentioned earlier that really interests me, because I served on, while serving in the North Carolina Senate, I served on our state's IT committee, and this issue was very much at the forefront, particularly because so many of our systems were built on COBOL, and in a lot of cases we had a hard time finding people alive that could work on COBOL. But you mentioned a situation where an agency converted 1 million lines of COBOL code to Java. I've never heard that practice before, so can you tell us a little bit how practical is that? Just plugging it in and letting it translate? How reliable is it? How expensive is it? Do you save any money when you use that process relative to just starting out with a blank hard drive?
I'm going to try to answer all of those questions. And I'm going to start with, is there a process and are there reliable tools? Much like Chairwoman Mace, I started my career in financial services, and there are definitely tools that are capable of making those types of transitions with these points. It was 7 million lines of code of COBOL into 1.2 approximately of Java. The tools that were used and tested in that process got about 70% of it right. So there still had to be some hands-on work with people who understand the business processes of the agency to address those things that aren't an easy fit. There are many automation tools today that are proven, have been proven by multiple industries, that can perform at a similar level. The expense you can save because you now didn't go hire all those COBOL programmers that everyone's fighting over, and you used a technology tool, but you can't bypass the fact that you have to have skilled resources that understand the business and mission processes in those agencies to take it the last mile and manage the implementation.
If I may, sir, there's also currently the development of artificial intelligence, AI, and some of the tools that the chairwoman mentioned earlier. The impact that those are going to have on the ability of the government to manage its legacy IT is going to be very interesting to watch in the coming months. That may be a significant force multiplier, making it easier to do those kinds of efforts where you translate old code that no one can maintain or update anymore, and you use the AI to translate it into something that is easier to work with.
Thank you for that. And so let's be realistic. What we need to do to modernize is appropriate more money. I mean, it's going to take resources. However we choose to verbalize it, that's what it boils down to. And we don't have unlimited resources. We do have to be responsible with the taxpayers' dollars. And so I foresee that there would need to be some level of prioritization. Do you know, has there been a process put in place to prioritize the agencies where we begin? If so, where do we find that prioritization? And if there's not, how do we go about prioritizing the agencies that we need to fund first to modernize.
So I would add a nuance there that I wouldn't focus on modernizing an agency. I would identify specific systems that can bring the most benefit or are the most risky and prioritize funding towards them. But I think the process to identify all of the legacy systems and then prioritize is one that we can focus on, and legislatively may be a solution for you to explore.
And sir, I might add that more focus first, because in some cases, modern technology is actually going to save money, effort, or improve the mission of the agency. And an example may be in one particular department, we modernized all the forms and processing and an exchange process between 3 different federal agencies. And what that meant in that efficiency is that we did not have backlog and we didn't have calls coming into their support centers. So we actually saved money. It didn't appear in the IT budget, but the agency itself saved significant money and delivered on their mission much better.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. And this concludes our hearing this afternoon. In closing, I want to thank our panelists once again for their testimony today. I know there are many different tools and applications that they're using, the private sector and the government sector, for converting COBOL to Java. Thank you for bringing up that example. I know folks that use GitHub Copilot to program, they get about 70% of their code from it, and then they got to manually do the rest of it, as you mentioned in your example. But I guess about a year ago, Copilot also announced that they could take COBOL code and make it into Java using a couple of tools that they have, but there are others, CloudFrame, there are many different other tools. So thank you for utilizing that, using that as an example. And as I stated in my opening statement, we're going to be introducing legislation to help improve modernization efforts with IT legacy systems. This hearing has reinforced, this sort of need for these kinds of bills and legislation. So we appreciate your feedback, and we look forward to continuing our conversation as we work together and to do that and putting that together. Before we adjourn, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the U.S. Chamber of Commerce statement and letter without objection. So ordered. And with that, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for your response. If there is no further business and without objection, we are adjourned.